everyone, and welcome to another Scots We Hate podcast. And today I'm joined by writer F Peterson to discuss The Purified, his latest novel published by Scotland Street Press. Hello, Calum.
Hello there, Alistair.
So first of all, I want to say I finished The Purified last night and I absolutely loved it. I'm very wary of giving away any spoilers. So what can you tell us about it?
Yes, without giving away spoilers, it's not an easy task. It's set in Duncul, which is an imaginary village in the Highlands, Central Highlands, sort of joined on to the West Coast, because those are the two places in the Highlands that I grew up, and where I live now. And it's the story of Eamon Ansgar, who is the hero of the first novel, which was Errant Blood. And here he is living in his castle with his wife now and his young child. And then something terrible happens. There's a murder in the village, and he sets out to find out, well, he thinks he knows who's vaguely responsible to begin with. He sets out to find out and uncovers all kinds of terrible things all in the local vicinity. So it's very much focused and all set in this very small community. He discovers, that this very small part of the world is intensely connected to everywhere else in the world, which is kind of the theme of the first book as well. This idea that we live in as isolation in the Highlands is one of the things that I'm dispelling. I didn't set out to do that, but it's just the way things turned out when I was writing these books, that there's no such thing as isolation really. This sort of romantic pastiche of the Highlands, we're living in wee crofts with pretty castles and all that kind of thing. And it's I suppose people think it's something like the Shire in Lord of the Rings. But what happened in the first book, what happens in this book is you soon discover that there's, I suppose, forces that permeate the entire planet have their nexus in these small communities, which I think is true to life.
To say that there's a lot going on in Duncul, particularly in the second book, is really understating it. There are all these different things, but as you say, the connection, it's like this in the book. It's the center of the universe, and I guess wherever you are in your own center of the universe, and everything that's going on does affect you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I wanted to explore in this book. It was written at the time. I started writing it in, I suppose, 2018, and so it was pre-COVID. Yeah. But it was leading up to, and it was 2019. It was leading up to. There was all the ferment in the United States with Trump being president, and I was spending an awful lot of time, and also it was post-Brexit as well. So I was spending an awful lot of time, I suppose you could say, a pretentious way of putting it is studying these issues. But basically I was on social media like everyone else, and I was marveling at the level of vitriol from both sides of the argument that was, especially what was going on in the States at the time, and they started all these protests with the Antifa movement and all that kind of thing. And then there was the backlash against that, and there was this big battle. And but I was watching this obviously from my wee house on a croft in the Highlands. But I wanted to examine I wanted to make sense of all these things, and that's what these books, even the first book, which is quite a different plot, but it's really an attempt to look at the world and try to make sense. And in the process of writing, I feel in myself I managed to make some kind of sense of what I thought about these issues and where I stood on these things that were rearing their heads. These big powerful issues, and also trying to, I suppose, at the same time, also trying to achieve a certain level of equanimity as regards everything, because it's very easy to get caught up by I mean, that's a dramatic way of putting it, but the level of despair that comes at us when we're looking at these things, you know. So yeah, that was the starting point. It was really trying to make sense of all that stuff. I mean, that's a very general way of putting it, but I suppose the way that people describe it is the culture war, but I don't think it's got very much to do with culture, to be honest. I mean, it's a political battle, and the culture war kind of dignifies the argument, but I don't think it's, you know, culture is a better thing than what's been argued about here, I think.
Well, I think it's bigger in that sense, because there are a lot of the themes, if we can look at them without going into specifics. You've got ecology, future of the planet, you've got religion, nationalism, even the rewilding of the Highlands, which I did enjoy, the kind of creatures that are taken there, and you know, even you've got anarchism, and you know, there are big themes going on here, as you say, and there maybe, I can understand now you talking about when it was written, why these things were in the headlines, but they're still in the headlines now, just in a different way.
Yeah. Yes. So, and I think what I realized while I was writing the book, and then thinking about it afterwards, because the process of writing for me is very much following a plot. It's very much, you know, I start with the murder. I mean, I'm sure a lot of thriller writers work in the same way, and then you try and work out what happened. You don't necessarily know yourself at the beginning what happened. And then you go through the whole process of writing the book, and then you come out at the end and you think, well, what's that book actually about? And then that, you know, that for me, the interesting process for me was discovering. So when I first, you know, when I was writing, I thought, well, this is about, for example, the debate about rewilding. It's about, you know, our relationship to the planet. How do we see the planet as being something to be exploited? Do we see the planet as something to be preserved? That argument. What I discovered in writing it is that for me, that's really it's not a big argument. I mean, I'm actually, you might not think this from having just read the book, but I'm really in favor of rewilding. I mean, I think it's an obvious, it's a very obvious yes for me for rewilding. You know, what do we have at the moment? We have a situation in the Highlands where the top predator is, we do have a top predator, it's a fund manager in +4s, you know, but we have this huge problem of the hugely overpopulated with red deer, and you know, it's kept down by very expensive tourism, bankers coming up from London and shooting the deer. And you know, the obvious solution in a sophisticated society is to reintroduce the top predators. I mean, they have top predators all over Europe. They have wolves all over Europe, and people don't cower in their beds, you know, while worrying about the wolves. I think so. That argument for me is settled. And there's a big movement in the Highlands now. Quite a few big landowners. I mean, the biggest landowner, Anders Poulsen, he wants to rewild his estates, and there's plenty of others like him. So what I mean, it wasn't really, in the end, it wasn't about that. It's really about this dynamic between the rich and the poor. That's what I discovered as the more interesting and far more pertinent story to discover. I mean, this is the story, without being this isn't giving a spoiler. There's a dynamic between somebody who wants to stay on his land and somebody that wants him off his land. I mean, that's a story that's been repeated. Most famously, of course, of Donald Trump trying to clear people off his golf course near Aberdeen, which I'm sure lots of people will remember. And I know of another case, a similar case happening right now down the road from me. It's exactly the same story. A billionaire guy wants to clear the whole glen, and there's one man who refuses to leave his croft. So you know, that's the more interesting story, because this dynamic between the rich and the poor. And that's a theme that comes up again and again. It comes up even at the very core of the story, the hero of the story, Eamon Ansgar, is a landowner.
Yeah.
And he has all the privilege that goes with that and the responsibility that goes with that. But the reason I find him interesting is because he's somebody who actually thinks about these things. He thinks about his responsibility, he thinks about his guilt, and so he's very much a conflicted landowner. He's not a triumphalist landowner, which unfortunately, in my experience, most of them are. But that's a theme that's right at the core of the book, and I can't talk too much about it, as we say, about spoilers, but it's something which becomes very relevant towards the end of the book, is this whole idea of ownership and not ownership and what it means. And then, of course, there's the anarchists in the book, different kinds of anarchists. But of course, at the root of the anarchist idea is, I mean, it's been around for more than a century, is this very straightforward idea of property is theft.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something which the hero himself has to hear through the story, is this idea that we actually live in a system where we talk about violence, we talk about the violence of the Antifa movement, for example, but we live in a system which is necessarily propped up by a very, very intrinsic violence, which is the violence of private property. Mm-hmm. So that's another thing that I wanted to look at. Well, I didn't even know I wanted to look at that when I was writing it, but that's what I ended up looking at.
It's so interesting to talk about the way you write, that you start with a thriller, and we'll go on to the way it's written in a bit, and then you find the kind of what it's really about. I think that's really interesting from a reader's point of view, because that's kind of what you do as well. You go in expecting, well, especially people who have read your first book, you think, well, there's going to be mysteries to solve and murders and violence and all of these things, and then you start to get into the themes. And it's also interesting to hear that you started writing it in 2018, and I've read it now, on the other side of COVID, for want of a better term, and to read it in that way, because there are also themes of nature finding a way, fighting back. And that's something that came through, certainly the first lockdown, was that, we weren't on the streets, we weren't driving cars, we weren't going to work and all of those things. And you could hear the birds in the sky, and I'm living in the city, I live in Glasgow, and it was really odd to you didn't have traffic noise, you had natural noise again, things like that. And also there's a gathering that happens. And I almost started thinking, this is it's not like COP26, but it's a big gathering in a place that you might not expect. And it kind of fits into the themes as well. So there's so much you can read into it now that you wouldn't have thought about when you were writing it. You couldn't have thought about when you were writing it.
Yes, and also, I mean, that gathering that you refer to, this is another theme that I find fascinating not in a nice way, is this, I suppose, the way that it's generally described is the rise of populism. To me, a more succinct way of saying it is that it's just the cynicism of, there's a certain kind of politician who, the level of cynicism is astounding, and this is happening all over Europe.
Yeah,
and it's happened in Britain, that phenomena of the populist politician who is completely detached from any real care about the population, and it's a bizarre phenomena. I find it's like, people compare it to fascism. Well, of course, I sometimes think that the fascists were less disingenuous than these guys. They didn't have the history of fascism to look back on,
Yeah.
But we do. We've got the lessons of history. We've seen where fascism leads, and Mussolini, for all his wickedness, didn't have the lessons of history to reflect on. that we're, you know, these guys now are really, I mean, they're really terribly cynical people. And I think that that's another thing that really bears scrutiny, is watching what's happening all over Europe with these guys.
And it's so interesting because you do have these cynical characters, but then you also have these people who appear to be, anyway, true believers, you know, and are absolutely dedicated in ways that are, you know, terrifying to their cause and to their belief, and other people who are dedicated in more recognizable ways as well.
Yes. So that's true. There's these, as I say, there's these cynical players. There's these people who are just out, really, at the end of the day, they're just out for themselves, and they'll take advantage of any prejudice they can get hold of. But then there are these people who are, as you say, they're deeply sincere and convinced, and you know, very, very, very passionate, and I would say very, 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 very wrong. But they are, but they're not disingenuous. They are sincere people, and that's another phenomenon which really bears looking at. And you can't put them in the same category. And they're being taken advantage of, and they're being led by cynical politicians. But they do have deep concerns which you can't ignore. You know, we as, you know, we can't ignore them. So, and that's on both sides of the argument. That's on which would broadly be described as the left and the right, but it exists on both sides. I mean, so ultimately, yes. So the main character, Eamon, he has to come to terms, and he has to gain some sort of understanding through the action of the story about the significance, the value of these different groups. And that's the journey I hope the reader goes on, is contemplating things, and the way that I see the novel, and even even a novel like this, which is merely a thriller, as a way of contemplating things without necessarily coming to a conclusion, and that's the value of it. I've never been able to write essays because I can't come to any real conclusions, but.
So it's interesting, when I read Errant Blood, I compared it to Ian Banks, and I think the stuff that we've just spoken about is why I compared it to Ian Banks, in that he was writing thrillers, but there was often a lot more going on in his books. But this time round, I was also thinking about Agatha Christie, because when I started writing the book, reading the book, it's, you don't give anything away, and you don't give anything away for quite some time. There's lots of questions. Who's that person? Why are they doing that? Why is this person acting that way? What's the background to this? And it goes on, I'd say 100 pages or more into the book. Was that something you deliberately wanted to do, to kind of keep the secrets close to you until pretty much near the end? In fact, some right at the end.
Yes, well, I have a confession to make here, is that actually when I was writing it, I really didn't know how it was going to end. And I don't know if I had a vague idea, but I wanted to discover myself during the process of writing where I was going.
Right.
And I hope that I've managed to. I hope that I've managed to sustain the level of suspense, the level of threat for the reader, without losing him or her too. You know, without them getting too lost in the thicket of characters and plot lines and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, that's partly the reason why it appears like that, because there is a sense of confusion. Who would, here's the murder at the beginning. Who would commit the murder? Why would they commit? There's lots of different reasons why it could happen, and I didn't make up my mind until a good chunk through the book who the actual murderer was. So that's probably why it appears like that. I'm not sure if that's a good thing.
It is, it really is, because you've got, I mean, Eamon really is your detective, isn't he? He's your, through your eyes, he's trying to solve what's going on, and he's confused, and he follows the red herrings, or the deliberate, different streets to go down and say, well, it's this person, and then realizes and uncovers other things. So it absolutely, but it's interesting to hear that's how you work. You wanted to discover what's going on yourself, which I know, having spoken to other thriller writers, sometimes they absolutely have to know the end before they know the beginning.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
not just the murders, but actual, you know, the conclusions. But I think that makes for a really, how you've done it makes for a really thrilling read in itself. And also there's a lot of scenes that really brought me up short. They're quite shocking in their kind of violence that goes on. Mm-hmm. And I wondered, if you're writing that way, are you shocked when these things happen? Are you surprised, rather, when these things happen?
I am. I'm constantly surprised, and I also shocked. It was funny because somebody asked me the other night, I was doing a reading the other night, and they asked me about violence in the book and whether I found it cathartic, and whether where I got, you know, the inspiration for the violence. And the first answer I came up with was that I really don't like writing violence, and I don't like writing wicked, evil, horrible characters. I find it actually, but it's obviously necessary. I mean, you can't have a thriller without having baddies, and but I you know, obviously, so but I found that a very, very painful experience. I mean, in the first book, there's a very nasty guy, and he made me ill. I mean, at the time I was writing, I was feeling, you know, actually physically sick from writing the really nasty guy at the center of Errant Blood. And but then, of course, there is a kind of catharsis when you manage, when obviously another thing that happens in the thriller is that the good guys win in the end. And so there is that catharsis, that, you know, there's violence and then there's counter violence, and there is a level of, you know, there's a level of, so I think the person asked me this question was trying to work out what kind of a psychopath I am, that I can write such grotesque scenes. So it's there, the violence is certainly there, but I don't, you know, it's not something I relish. It's something that really repels me. The other question that this person asked is where does this come from? You know, why? How am I able to write this violence? And I was trying to explain to them that I grew up in a housing scheme in East Lothian in the 1970s, and violence was just the currency of everyday life. You know, it's maybe something that some of my readers, especially of the younger generation, don't really understand. They don't get what it was like, you know, at that time, in that environment. You know, violence was just normality. When I look at my own children, you know, who've grown up here in the Highlands, and they've no idea the experience that we went through when we were kids, you know, at that time. So, but anyway, I digress. I was going to say something about, you were saying about Agatha Christie, and, you know, that sort of her. I just
wondered as well, when I thought that, what your influences actually were, because certainly the way that I could imagine at the end, you know, you start to see things start to fall into place, and you know, you are left satisfied by the end, you know. And I did wonder what your kind of influences were in terms of writing.
Well, you mentioned Ian Banks, and what I loved about Ian Banks, and I still love about Ian Banks, is that the range of experiences that he could write about in the Scottish context, which, you know, the one book of his which I always remember, I mean, I haven't actually read all his books, he wrote quite a few, but is the one called Whit. I don't know if that rings a bell with you, but it's got that theme of you know, it's about a religious cult, and it's about somebody, you know, escaping from a religious cult, and it's all set in, you know, it's set in Britain, but it starts off in Scotland, and I think Stirlingshire, and that's what I loved about him, was that he, as you say, he took all these, I suppose you could say, philosophical or political themes, and he put them into these very, very easy to read stories. You know, it was very much, it wasn't obscure in any way what he was doing. So Ian Banks, in terms of a Scottish writer, and then of course the things that influence you so much are things that you see in your childhood and you read in your childhood. John Buchan, and his, I mean, and I can never remember whether it's from reading the book or seeing the film, but it's the 39 steps, and the part of the 39 steps which is in the Highlands is one of these things that had a huge resonance for me, because you've got to see your own environment in other people's writing and in filmmaking for it to come alive in your imagination, I think. And that's so John Buchan in that sense. But I mean, I say this to people, and people, they maybe don't recognize the influence, but I mean, Dickens has always been hugely formative to me. And I suppose it's because when I was a kid, my mother used to read David Copperfield and Oliver Twist to me, and that just, it's never left me, that world. And I can't write about London in the 1840s. I can only really write about what I know, which is the Highlands. I would like to write about other places, where I've lived in South Africa, for example. But I've said this before. It's not that I've forgotten South Africa; it's that I can't get to grips with that universe, because I haven't been there for so long. I haven't been there for more than a decade. So I had to write about my own environment. But I suppose that's in terms of influences, in terms of modern influences, more recent influences than that. I mean, I love a good thriller. I mean, I like Lee Child. I mean, I don't write anything like him, but he's fantastic at plotting. He's fantastic at driving the story forward, and then Robert Harris, of course, who's a bit more, there's a bit more sort of weight to his background than Lee Child. So I'd say, I mean, and then of course I do watch a lot of telly like everyone else, and I think that influences my work. I mean, I do. I was brought up to believe that there was something wrong with watching too much telly. You were supposed to read books, but there is an awful lot of good stuff. There's an awful lot of good series, and as we all know, absolutely. Very well done. It's as they say, a golden age of the television series.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting talking about Dickens and Copperfield, going back to what you spoke about at the beginning. I mean, there's the kind of ultimate writer who looks at the difference between the rich and the poor, and putting them together, and the themes that are in there, I can absolutely, now that you've mentioned it, see coming through, and that idea of pace from a modern thriller. I think with your book, you almost speed up as you kind of keep going, because you want those answers. You want to understand what's kind of gone in the past. In terms of the setting, then let's go back to that, because it is a place where the old meets the new. It is, as you say, it's not the stereotyped 39 steps, the bothy in the middle of the Highlands and nobody near it. It is looking at that modern thing, and it seems that it is very important to you. Part of me thought, well, one, it's an area that more cynical part thought, well, it's still a place where you might not get mobile reception, which, in a lot of thrillers these days, a lot of people say, oh, mobiles have killed the thriller because you can But where Duncul is, it's still a place where you might not get that kind of reception.
Absolutely.
So was it really important for you to kind of present this as a place where, anyone that knows the Highlands knows it's absolutely where the old Scotland meets the new Scotland?
Yes, I think that is a theme. As you say, there's this Scotland, the Highlands, it's a romantic pastiche, in the tourist brochures and all that sort of thing, and it's portrayed as somehow being, it's like the film Brigadoon. That's what people expect they're going to get, and it has enormous resonance. And of course, and I think from my parents, because my parents moved to the Highlands, they moved from the Lowlands, and my father moved from Newcastle, and so they came to the Highlands, I think, with sort of romanticism about what it was like. But of course, when you're the child of those parents and you actually grow up in the place, you know the other side of the story. It's just like everywhere else. And so, but there is still this very strong residue of a feudal structure in the Highlands. You still have these big estates, big old houses and castles, very wealthy people. And then you have the village, you know, at the end of the road down there. And it's so in terms of the old and the new, that structure, that social structure is very, very, you know, it's a constant in everyone's life. And lots of people work for the estates, they depend upon the estates. So, but there's still this tension. And then the funny thing is about the old, of course, in lots of ways, the Highlands is not as old as people imagine. It's a manufactured, because I mean, if you think about it, it really only starts in the 18th century. This structure, this vision of how people live and what it starts with. It even, you know, it starts with Boswell and Johnson, and then it, you know, it starts with the Victorians, the Queen Victoria coming up and defining what the Highlands was. So it's a strange thing. It's a manufactured romantic world picture. And it's, why is it manufactured is a good question. You know, why does it exist like that? Who does it serve? That this is the world that we all live in. So that brings us back to the other, you know, the other theme of the rich and the poor. So yeah, I'm trying to remember what your question was.
Well, really, it's about the how you wanted to represent the Highlands rather than, you know, have because in the book, as I say, it really does become the center of the world for that time. Not just Eamon and the people around him center, but you do have this conference, for want of a better word. You have this threatening event, you know, possibly happening, and so. And the media does descend upon it. Yes. So in how I wanted to represent it, was as you say, the Highlands is a functioning part of our country, is a functioning part of the world. It's a real place and real things are happening. And I suppose there is an element of dispelling the myth. I mean, I live in a very, very tourist-centered part of the Highlands. I live right next to Loch Ness. It's like living next to the pyramids of Giza. It's everyone in the world wants to come here, and they all have a very particular thing that they want to see, not just the monster, but they want to see Brigadoon. That's what they want to see. And I think part of my mission, if you like, is to dispel that in these books, is dispel that. First of all, to dispel the irrelevance of the Highlands, the idea that the Highlands are an irrelevant place, and they're merely a theme park. So yes, I do have that. I mean, it's remarkable how I mean, I was learning just recently the enormous significance of the Shetland Isles in the cocaine trade in Britain, which is something I only learned about recently, that there's huge quantities of drugs coming into Shetland. And you just wouldn't associate, you know, that with that. You would imagine that Shetland, what is, you know, Shetland? People think it's, you know, it's somehow in the past and somehow on the edge, but actually it's at the center of something which is very relevant to all of us. So I think that about Inverness. If people have never been to Inverness, they might have an idea about it. But I've been up quite a few times, and every time I go, it's getting bigger, it's expanding or whatever. And then, you know, you've got the traffic through the Caledonia Canal, which, you know, there's boats everywhere. You know, this is not, you're more likely to bump into a boat than bump into, you know, a monster or anything else like that. And it has become, I guess it's that thing, you want the people who run it want the tourist trade to be as busy as possible, but the whole thing behind the tourist trade is that you're going somewhere which is almost untouched. So that's right as well.
and it's becoming more and more touched as the tourist trade increases. And of course, we've got this huge change going on in the landscape with wind turbines going up everywhere and it becoming a real center for that. But that's been going on for a long time. I mean, my father came to the Highlands to build roads, you know, to the west, and to work on the dams, you know, that were going up 50 years ago, you know, the big hydroelectric dams. And so that process has been going on for a very long time. But yes, I would say that there's just another Highlands that people don't know about. Of course, it's not as dramatic as maybe the plot lines in my book, but
no, I think that would be something if that became true. So you're published by Scotland Street Press, and I'm interested how you came to work with them, because you don't publish a huge amount of fiction. But so how did you end up working with them?
Well, actually, what happened to Scotland Street Press is it's actually a relative of mine who runs Scotland Street Press, and but I've been writing for quite a while, and I've been writing for the theatre prior to I'd never been published as an author, but I've been writing for the theatre, and I'd been involved in other aspects. You know, I've been working for children's television, always as a writer, but in a very minor role. You know, I was the kind of guy that people asked to chip in his 2p worth every now and again. And so I had this book, Errant Blood, and I'd written it, but I'd put it to one side. And, you know, I'm actually a builder by trade, so I've been, you know, I'm a busy man, and I had this book, and then I was approached, you know, by the publisher to see, you know, what I had, because they knew that I'd been writing for years, as most writers, writing compulsively for a very long time. So I have a sort of a slush pile of my own, and then this is what came to the fore. So it seems to have got a reasonably good critical appraisal, the Errant Blood.
Yeah.
And so that really encouraged, you know, that then I got an agent, and the agent said, write another one. You know, insisted that I write another one. So there's probably another one coming as well.
That's what I was going to ask you. That was going to be my next question. Will there be another Duncul story to tell?
There's a pile of them in my head, because there's a pile of stuff that I want to look at, and I think that what I'll do with the next book is I'll be more. I think the story will be less. Will be more believable. In other words, to kind of bring it a bit more down to earth, less of a. You know, the first book, the plot is quite out there, and then the second book is probably slightly less so. But I think that I'm going in the direction of something that's more mundane, but also, you know, really powerful stories. I've got a couple of stories there, things that, but I'd like to do it in the same environment, with the same reference points, and just bring something else in from the outside world that you can, and it will be more on these political themes and things that are relevant to us today. You know, there's terrible forces on the move, as far as I can see. And I think that there are things that we really have to scrutinize and question about ourselves and about the political environment that we're in the process of creating. You know, so that's what I want to use this as a way of doing that. And I hope I'm able to do it without becoming a tendentious, you know, someone's got a message. I don't want to be like that. I want, you know, it's got to be first and foremost a good story.
Yeah. Well, I'm really pleased about all those things. First of all, I think you've got some really great characters who I was so pleased to meet up with them again after, you know, Errant Blood. It's like, oh yeah. I mean, it'd been a while, 4 years, I think, since Errant Blood. Is that right? 2017?
Yeah.
So, you know, you have to kind of, takes a wee while to get back into them and you go, oh yeah, we're back. And I really enjoy spending time with a lot of these people. But also, you represent different points of view. It's not just you going with one polemic, going, this is what I believe, and I'm going to ram it down your throat. You're actually asking the reader to think about these things for themselves. And I think in a thriller, that's still quite rare.
Yeah, I think that it really comes from the main character, Eamon Ansgar. I mean, he's a guy who has he has his, you know, he lives in a castle, and I wanted that. The first was a very simple reason why I wanted to do that in the first place. I wanted somebody to have the freedom and the means. I mean, initially I wanted Eamon Ansgar to travel around the world, you know, having James Bond style adventures, and that's why. But actually, he's become a really interesting character because he's not a very convinced person in either direction himself. He's somebody who's a bit of a loss about what to do, how to do it. He's not a superhero in fact, most of the things he does, if you go back and look at the book, most of the things he does are really stupid and clumsy, and he gets himself into a hell of a lot of trouble, makes loads of mistakes, and it's actually the people around him who are have much more agency in solving problems. I mean, and he's got this relationship with his brother Stevie, who lives in a caravan in the quarry down the road, his half brother, and I think that to me is the center of the book, is that dynamic. Of course, he's got his relationship with his wife as well, which also provides another balance to his propensities. But he's a bit of an idiot, Eamon Ansgar, you know, in lots of ways. And then you've got his brother Stevie, who really brings him down to earth, and he has this constant presence, because his brother Stevie has no money at all, and so that dynamic between him and Rona, his wife, and then Stevie's brother, they're what make Eamon a valuable agent in the story. I think without them, you know, he'd be just a series of disasters himself. I mean, yeah.
Because he almost follows these things for them, doesn't he? Certainly when things start to get a bit, you know, knife edge, then that's what motivates him, isn't it?
That's what motivates him, but also he's landed in this position of being a landlord and a landowner. You know, he's inherited everything, but he's not really he never actively pursued it. It's just where he's ended up in his life, and then he has to kind of find his way through life like all of us. And he's very wealthy. I mean, he's not that wealthy, but he, you know, comparatively pretty wealthy. But then, you see, I find that an interesting story because, you know, we're all living in the West. I've spent a lot of time living in Africa, in South Africa, and I've got lots of family out there. And the truth about all of us, really, in lots of ways, in the West, is we are all on a global scale. We're wealthy, and we have to face the same dilemmas he has, or the same questions that he has to face about his standing in the community and the role he has to play, and how we're you know, we're all he's caught up in this system called capitalism, as we all are. We all participate in it, and we're caught in it, and we're motivated by it, and we're directed by it, a lot of the time unbeknownst to ourselves, and we end up behaving in certain ways and making mistakes. The part of the system that we're, as you could say, trapped in. So that's why I find him more and more interesting the more I write about him, because he's a wealthy guy, you know, and he has all these relationships with everyone, you know, that's not wealthy, and that's really something that I think, certainly my life, you know, people around me, that's our lives are an awful lot to do with that. They're an awful lot to do with capitalism. They're an awful lot to do with making money and spending money and all that kind of stuff. So I like to think at the root of it, maybe there is this somewhere going to emerge in the long term out of the series, with some kind of critique of the economic system that we live in, because that is something that I'm thinking about, but I don't know how it's going to emerge and how it's going to, yeah.
It's interesting you saying that, because you do have the Anarchists Manifesto. I won't go into details at the end, which is absolutely, you know, the kind of most extreme way of breaking what you're talking about. And it's also interesting you talk about Eamon as you know, this an idiot, your words there, because if he may be that, he's a well-meaning, he's trying to do the right thing. And sometimes that's all you can do is try and do the right thing.
He's very well-meaning and caring, but he's not, he doesn't always, you know, he's not doing the right thing. You know, he doesn't, a lot of the time he's being very clumsy, a very clumsy guy in terms of relationships and all that kind of thing. So he's, but he is, well, of course he's got to be well-meaning. I mean, you've got to have some empathy with the guy.
Absolutely. Well, Calum, it's been so lovely chatting to you, and thanks very much for taking the time to do it, and all the best with the Purified.
Thank you very much, Alistair. Thanks for having me. It's been really interesting talking to you. It's been really good for me a good way of me thinking about the book.
Oh, well, that's great. And we'll be back soon with someone completely different. Cheers.